On June 18, 1977, Charles Morgan's body was found near his car on a desert road in Tucson, Arizona, about 40 miles west of his family home. At the time his body had been discovered, authorities estimated that his life had ended roughly 12 hours earlier, with a single bullet fired at close range to the back of his head. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, a gun holster, and carrying a concealed knife. It would seem Charles had come prepared for a confrontation. There was also a supply of ammunition found inside his car, as well as other weapons and sets of handcuffs. Was he planning on detaining someone? Rather strangely, one of his own teeth was found wrapped up in a tissue in his car, as well as a pair of sunglasses, which were later determined to belong to someone else. Another strange detail discovered by local investigators was that his car had been modified so that it could be unlocked from the fender. Why would such a modification be made? Also, there was a map with directions of how to get to the location his murder took place, which may indicate that this area wasn't familiar to him. Another strange piece of evidence which was discovered was a $2 bill which was pinned to his underwear. What made this $2 bill even stranger was that it had 7 Spanish names listed beginning with the letters A through G, as well as a Bible citation which said Ecclesiastes 12, with arrows pointing at the 1 and 8 on the serial number. On the back of the bill, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were each numbered 1 through 7. Furthermore, there was a rough map of some roads that led between Tucson and the Mexican border, leading to a place called Robles Junction and a town called Sasabe, an area that investigators believe was likely involved in smuggling, as the area had a small farm which also had a few aeroplane landing strips. Later examinations established that Morgan had been shot with his own .357 Magnum, which was found next to him, but no fingerprints at all could be found on the gun. At this point, you might ask yourself, who was Chuck Morgan, and why had this happened to him? How did he come to end up like this, with all those bizarre details and puzzling pieces of evidence? Would you find it hard to believe that it was concluded that Chuck took his own life? If so, you're not the only one. Sit back and get ready to hear all about one of the USA's most cryptic cases, one which many still believe is unsolved and unexplained. With all the evidence gathered at the scene, you may have thought that 39-year-old Charles Morgan, or Chuck as he liked to be called, was probably some kind of experienced or hardened criminal gang member. However, that really wasn't the case. Chuck was a family man with a wife and 4 daughters. He also had a successful business and escrow agency in Tucson, Arizona, of which he was the president. So on the surface, he was not really the typical criminal type. Well, at least not the type that turns up to off-road meetings with a gun, knife and bulletproof vest anyway. But as we all know, looks can be deceiving. On the morning of March 22nd, Chuck drove the 2 youngest of his 4 daughters to school before heading to work like any other ordinary day. However, after dropping the 2 girls off, Chuck simply vanished, leaving his family puzzled and worried about what could have possibly happened to him. On March 25th, 3 long days after he went missing, Chuck came back home limping and in a rather terrible state. His wife Ruth recalls Chuck was missing a shoe, had a set of plastic handcuffs wrapped around one of his ankles, and his hands were bound together with a plastic zip tie. He was pointing at his throat, indicating he was unable to speak, so he wrote down on a piece of paper that he had been kidnapped and tortured. He also explained that he had a hallucinogenic drug poured down his throat, and if he ingested it fully, his nervous system would have totally been destroyed, causing either his immediate death or irreversible insanity. Chuck refused to reveal who had abducted and tortured him, and simply wrote down instructions for Ruth to move his car from outside, as he didn't want them to know that he had come home. He also didn't want to reveal who they were. Ruth moved the car, then came back inside and went to go and call the police, but Chuck stopped her immediately and wrote down, "If you call the cops, they'll kill all of us, even the girls." Morgan unveiled the secret behind a seemingly ordinary life and confessed to his wife that he was an undercover agent working for the federal government, specifically for the Treasury Department, which is the department responsible for maintaining systems that are critical to the nation's financial infrastructure. Chuck claimed that he had been helping them fight organised crime, with a focus on money laundering in particular. He told Ruth that the unidentified people who had captured him had taken his Treasury ID. What they planned to do with it exactly wasn't so clear. He also told Ruth that he was aware that a lot of laundering was taking place in the town, but added he was not involved in it himself. For the following week, Ruth nursed her husband by feeding him with an eyedropper, but although he physically recovered from this dreadful experience and his voice returned, he just wasn't the same. He was still a mental wreck and understandably very paranoid. Chuck turned into a tormented soul and started wearing a bulletproof vest every day in fear for his life. He also feared for the safety of his daughters and insisted that he drove them to and from school and informed them that nobody other than himself was authorized to collect them from the school. 2 months of what seemed like relative normality went by, and just when it seemed that the Morgan family could finally leave that dreadful episode behind them, things took a dramatic turn for the worse. On June 7th, Chuck disappeared again while on his way to work after visiting his parents early one morning. That was the last morning that any of his loved ones saw him again. He had gone to his parents' home specifically to speak to his father. He told him that if anything happens to him, there was a letter hidden in the house that would explain everything. He told his father not to tell Ruth about the letter, at least, not while he was still alive anyway, as he believed the less she knew, the safer she would be. 9 days after Chuck had gone missing, his wife received a phone call from a mysterious woman who said, "Chuck is all right." Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. The most interesting part of those verses reads, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." I'm no theologian, but this sounds very much like a reference to facing something bad or some kind of danger, but having faith in God that all will be well in the long run. But it definitely has a more hidden significance here. But what is it? Did the caller assume that Ruth would know? We'd be interested to hear your thoughts. It's obviously not just a coincidence that there are 7 Spanish names listed, and then 7 signers of the Declaration of Independence. The real question now is how the 2 sets of names relate to each other, and then how both relate to Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1-8. 2 days after receiving that cryptic message, Chuck's body was found. Did the caller assume Chuck really was going to be okay? If not, why make the phone call at all? Just to give his wife peace of mind, perhaps, if only for a short time. Charles Morgan's death was officially ruled to have been from a self-inflicted gun wound, but his wife refused to believe that he would be capable of doing such a thing. She simply believes that he wouldn't want to leave his family behind, least of all without writing a letter to each of them. So what really happened to him? How would he possibly shoot himself in the back of the head? People who do sadly make this kind of decision for themselves don't typically aim the gun here. Also, it seems rather bizarre that he would get kitted out with a bulletproof vest, only to go and do something like that. In an episode of the old TV series Unsolved Mysteries, investigator and journalist Don Devereaux, who was looking into the suspicious death of Charles, justly stated, "It is not a very normal place to shoot oneself. I've never seen in all my years as a journalist a fellow taking himself out in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shooting himself in the back of the head." Did Chuck really decide to end his own life, leaving behind a trail of mysterious clues while being a potential witness in fraud and laundering cases? There are so many peculiar details that emerged during the investigation, and also during our research. One being the fact that Morgan was right-handed, but gun residue was found on his left hand. The fact that the gun residue was found on his hand is probably the reason why investigators leaned towards the idea that he shot himself. But isn't it possible he had fired the gun at someone beforehand? The fact that there were no fingerprints on his gun should surely end the theory that he did this to himself, since if he shot himself, he wouldn't have been able to wipe the fingerprints off the gun, would he? Chuck was clearly trying to protect himself with the vest, the knife, the gun, etc. So why would he end himself then? Also, some of the evidence found at the scene points towards someone else being present when Chuck died. More specifically, the sunglasses. Who did they belong to? How was it determined that they didn't belong to him? They could easily be dismissed as belonging to a friend who left them there, but nobody came forward to claim them. Another interesting fact is that Arizona is the only state that allowed blind trust ownership of real estate. According to this law, people could buy a property without being traced. Therefore, an escrow agent, such as Morgan, was the only person who knew an owner's identity in cases like this. At the time of his disappearance, Morgan was apparently doing escrow work for two alleged organised crime groups, the Ned Warren family and the Joe Bonanno family. Could it be possible that the mob got rid of him as he could reveal their identity and whereabouts? Maybe, but the mafia is not known historically to use drugs or hallucinogens for its hits, or torture for that matter. They would just break bones or kill the person to send a direct and clear message to everyone. Also, why would they phone his wife and leave a Bible reference? Interestingly, one organisation that has a history with hallucinogens is the CIA. Was it a cover story, just like the more recent mysterious death of MI6 agent Gareth Williams in 2010? Perhaps Morgan may have found out something someone didn't want him to know, so they had him killed and then bribed or threatened the police. When Unsolved Mysteries covered the case in the 90s, Lieutenant Curtis of the Prima County Sheriff's Department gave an interview which may support this theory. He said he knew Sheriff's Department intelligence officers who were working the case at the time. They thought the case really was a homicide and gang-related. He added that the individuals who he spoke to eventually left the department because of what they detected in this case and other cases combined, and that those same officers were in fear for their lives and eventually left law enforcement. Two of these individuals apparently even left the country. What about the unidentified woman who called Ruth 2 days before he was found? A few days after Morgan's death, the woman came forward and made herself known to police as Green Eyes. She told them that she had known Morgan and that she had seen him after he disappeared during the 9 days before his death. According to Green Eyes, Morgan showed her a briefcase with a lot of money in it, saying that he was going to use that money to buy off a hitman who had been hired to murder him. Morgan had told Green Eyes that in the briefcase there was a $90,000 contract out on his life that was escalating at the rate of $5,000 per day. Also, what happened to the letter Chuck had hidden in the house? Well, apparently, that letter has never been found, so we have no idea what information Chuck left behind, or if there ever was a letter at all. However, not long after Chuck's death, 2 men claiming to be FBI agents went to visit the Morgan family's home and abruptly turned the house upside down, searching for something, without giving any explanations to his wife, who felt extremely intimidated during the entire ordeal. Did those FBI agents find the letter and take it away, as it contained some information which was not to be disclosed? Perhaps the letter contained some sort of evidence that could have brought down some powerful people. Reporter Don Devereaux was on a mission to find out the truth, and one day he made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI regarding Morgan's case. And this is where another bizarre turn came. The FBI claimed that they had never even heard of Charles Morgan, and there was no file on him at all. Nevertheless, they opened an investigation and searched his house, and even interviewed Morgan's attorney. How do you explain that? Who were those men who had searched the house before? And who were they working for? Perhaps Chuck really was indeed an undercover federal agent working against the mob. Or was he working for them? Did the authorities help to cover up his mysterious death? Who was Green Eyes? A secret woman in his life? Or a fellow agent? Or just someone with connections to organised crime? What was that Bible passage meant to indicate? And what about all the other strange details? The tooth? The $2 bill? While the death of Charles Morgan may have been officially deemed to have been from a self-inflicted gun wound to the head, many people, understandably, think this case reached the wrong conclusion. Following the episode of Unsolved Mysteries, over 600 calls came into their call centre. Don Devereaux investigated every one of them. Between 1973 and when he was killed in 1977, Morgan was allegedly heavily involved in money laundering and doing large transactions in gold and platinum. And by large, we're talking amounts in excess of $1 billion a year in gold alone, the source of which was apparently Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. Murkier details came in, suggesting the involvement of either corrupt or undercover individuals from the US intelligence community. Some of the tips also mentioned involvement of Vietnamese government officials who were going into exile. The calls also led Devereaux to discover what was perhaps the trigger behind his elimination. Charles had apparently kept a set of duplicate records of all the dodgy dealings. While Morgan seemed to think that the duplicates would be some kind of protection, it proved to be that he had unintentionally sealed his own doom. To the criminals he was working for, it probably made him seem like an untrustworthy risk. And that was a risk none of those shady individuals wanted to take. For Don Devereaux, and anyone else familiar with the case, all this new alleged information clearly pointed out that Charles Morgan met his demise because he knew too much. Just as the story seems like it's taken as many twists as it could, more would emerge, 13 years after the death of Chuck Morgan. At around midnight on May 14th, 1990, 35-year-old Doug Johnston was found dead in his car in his computer graphics company car park. He had suffered a single gun wound behind his left ear from a distance estimated to have been at least 12 inches. At first, local authorities believed Doug turned the gun on himself. However, he was right-handed, there was no powder residue on his hands, and there was no gun found at the scene. Johnston's family and friends also could not and did not believe that Doug could have taken his own life. He had just completed a computer-aided drafting course and had graduated with honours and had even secured a job. Everything was going well for him. What's really interesting, and where the possible connection comes from, is that Johnston had a similar-looking house and drove a similar car to the crime journalist Don Devereaux, who lived across the street from the car park where Doug was killed. As a result, Devereaux took interest in the investigation and began to follow it, but eventually lost track of it over the course of the year. During the year after the death of Doug Johnston, Devereaux was contacted by Washington-based writer Dan Casolaro, who had requested he share some of his findings in relation to Morgan's death and dealings prior to it. Don agreed to do so. However, Dan Casolaro was found dead in a hotel room just before he could receive the information. Interestingly, according to Casolaro's brother, Dan was afraid of blood, and it would seem unlikely then that he would choose to end his life by inflicting a deep wound to his own wrists, as medical examiners had determined he did so. Furthermore, to add extra doubt, as if you even needed it, Dan's brother was a doctor, and he said that in the past Dan was reluctant to even allow him to prick his finger to take the smallest of blood samples. Many believe that Doug was killed after he was mistaken for Devereaux, and that Devereaux was targeted for his investigation in Charles's case, and this was somewhat confirmed 6 months after Dan Casolaro's death. In a phone call from one of his journalist connections, Devereaux was told that he was in fact the intended target that night. This information being relayed to him came from what was apparently a reliable source in the CIA. The caller also informed Devereaux that there have been, and there still are, contracts out to kill you. He also went on to suggest that this was due to his work supposedly being a threat to not just the mob in Phoenix, but also the CIA. Could it be that the CIA needed to silence him in order to keep him from interrupting their own investigations? Or were those particular agents rogue, and just as dirty as the mob? Well, things got even stranger when later 2 more sources, another from the CIA and one from Israeli intelligence, confirmed the death threats. What had Devereaux really found? It sounds like he was onto something bigger than he ever realised, and that Doug Johnston was very likely the innocent victim of a contract hit meant for Devereaux due to his work, which started with the mysterious death of Charles Morgan.